Baby witnessed Mother Bear delivering twins. During blizzard, what she did next put everyone in tears. The wind screamed like something alive and angry that night. It wasn't the kind of wind that simply blew through the mountains. This was different. This was the kind of wind that made the old wooden beams of their cabin groan and complain, as if the whole structure might just give up and let the storm have its way. Ethan Marshall pressed his palm against the cold window glass and felt it shake under his touch. The temperature had dropped so fast that afternoon that the moisture in the air had turned to ice crystals that now pelted the cabin like tiny hammers. He pulled his hand back and rubbed his fingers together, trying to bring some warmth back into them. The fire in the stone fireplace crackled and popped behind him, throwing dancing shadows across the room, but even its heat seemed to struggle against the cold that was trying to force its way through every tiny gap in the walls. His daughter sat on the thick rug near the fire, her small hands wrapped around a mug of hot chocolate that had long since gone cold. Lily Morgan was only 7 years old, but she had her mother's eyes. Those same green eyes that could see things others missed, things that mattered. She hadn't said much since the storm started, which was unusual for her. Normally, she would fill the cabin with questions and stories, and laughter that made the isolation of their mountain home feel less lonely. But tonight, she just sat there, staring into the flames, occasionally glancing toward the window as if she was waiting for something. Ethan watched her for a moment, wondering what was going through that little mind of hers. He had learned over the years that when Lily got quiet like this, she was usually thinking about something important. Something that adults might overlook, but that made perfect sense to a child who still believed in magic and wonder. The cabin had been in Ethan's family for 3 generations. His grandfather had built it with his own hands, cutting each log from the surrounding forest, fitting them together with a precision that modern builders would struggle to match. It sat in a small clearing about halfway up the mountain, surrounded by towering pines that usually provided shelter from the worst of the weather. But this storm was different. This storm had come out of nowhere, catching even the weather forecasters off guard. One moment, it had been a crisp but clear winter afternoon. The next, the sky had turned the color of old iron, and the wind had started its assault. Within an hour, the snow was falling so thick and fast that Ethan couldn't see more than a few feet beyond the windows. They were completely cut off now. The dirt road that connected them to the main highway would be impassable for days, maybe longer. The phone lines were already down, and the cell tower on the ridge had probably been knocked out too. It was just him and Lily and whatever supplies they had in the cabin. He walked over to the kitchen area and checked their food situation again, even though he had already done it twice since the storm started. They had enough canned goods and dried foods to last at least 2 weeks if they were careful. The propane tank for the stove was nearly full, and they had plenty of firewood stacked under the covered area beside the cabin. Water wouldn't be a problem either. The well pump was electric, but Ethan had installed a hand pump as a backup years ago. They would be fine. They just had to wait it out. Storms like this never lasted more than a few days, even the worst ones. Still, something about this one made him uneasy. Maybe it was the way it had come on so suddenly, or maybe it was the strange quality of the wind. It didn't sound like normal wind, it sounded almost like voices, rising and falling in patterns that seemed too deliberate to be random. Lily suddenly stood up and walked to the window, pressing her small nose against the glass. Her breath fogged it up immediately, and she wiped it clear with her sleeve. "Dad," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you hear that?" Ethan moved to stand beside her, looking out into the swirling white chaos beyond the glass. "Hear what, sweetheart?" "It's just the wind." But even as he said it, he realized she was right. there was something else. Something underneath the howling of the storm. It was rhythmic, almost like breathing, but deeper and more labored. It seemed to be coming from somewhere near the cabin, maybe from the direction of the woodshed. The woodshed was a simple structure about 20 feet from the main cabin, built to keep their firewood dry. It had 3 walls and a slanted roof, with the open side facing away from the prevailing winds. Ethan had reinforced it last summer, adding extra supports to make sure it could handle the weight of heavy snow. Now, as he strained to see through the storm, he thought he could make out its dark shape, but something looked different. There was something there that shouldn't be. A shadow that was too large, too solid to be just snow accumulation. He squinted, trying to make sense of what he was seeing, and then the shadow moved. It was subtle, just a slight shift, but it was definitely movement. Something alive was out there, something that had taken shelter against the woodshed. "Stay here," he told Lily, but she grabbed his arm with both hands. "No, Dad, don't go out there, please." There was real fear in her voice now, and Ethan felt it too. Whatever was out there was big, really big. In these mountains, that could mean a lot of things, but most of them weren't good when you were trapped in a cabin with no way to call for help. He thought about the rifle in the bedroom closet, but something made him hesitate. The thing outside, whatever it was, hadn't tried to get into the cabin. It was just sheltering from the storm, same as they were. Maybe it would move on when the weather cleared. Maybe they could just wait it out. But then they heard it again, that sound that wasn't quite wind. It was clearer now, and Ethan finally recognized it for what it was. It was the sound of an animal in distress. Not pain exactly, but effort. Tremendous effort. Like something was struggling with a task that was almost too much for it. Lily seemed to understand at the same moment he did. Her grip on his arm loosened, and her expression changed from fear to something else. Concern, maybe, or curiosity. "It needs help," she said simply, as if that explained everything. Ethan wanted to argue, to tell her that wild animals didn't need help from humans, that interfering with nature was dangerous and usually made things worse. But something in her eyes stopped him. That same look her mother used to get when she knew something important that she couldn't quite put into words. They stood there together, father and daughter, watching the shadow by the woodshed. The storm raged around them, but inside the cabin there was a strange sense of anticipation, like they were about to witness something extraordinary. Something that would change them both in ways they couldn't yet understand. The fire crackled behind them, sending sparks up the chimney, and the old clock on the mantel ticked steadily, marking time in its patient mechanical way. But time seemed to have taken on a different quality now. It felt stretched, like each second was longer than it should be, filled with more possibility than normal moments contained. Ethan found himself thinking about his wife, about how she would have handled this situation. She had always been braver than him when it came to the unknown. She would have grabbed a flashlight and marched out into that storm without a second thought, convinced that her presence could somehow make things better. It was one of the things he had loved most about her, that unshakable belief that kindness and courage could solve almost any problem. Lily had inherited that from her, that same fearless compassion that made her want to help every injured bird and lost dog they came across. Usually, Ethan tried to temper it with practical concerns about safety and reality, but tonight, with the storm isolating them from the rest of the world, those concerns seemed less important somehow. The sound came again, louder this time, and definitely from the direction of the woodshed. It was accompanied by another sound, a low rumbling that Ethan felt as much as heard. It vibrated through the floorboards and up into his bones. That was when he knew for certain what was out there. Only one animal in these mountains could make a sound like that. A bear, a very large bear from the sound of it. His first instinct was to grab Lily and retreat to the back of the cabin, to put as much distance between them and the animal as possible. Bears were unpredictable, especially when they were in distress. They could go from calm to violent in seconds, and their strength was beyond anything most people could imagine. A bear that size could tear through the cabin door like it was made of paper if it wanted to. But the bear wasn't trying to get in. It was just there, sheltering against the woodshed, making those strange, labored sounds. And now that Ethan knew what it was, the sounds made more sense. He had read about this years ago in one of the nature magazines his wife used to subscribe to. Bears sometimes gave birth during winter storms, when the barometric pressure dropped suddenly. The stress of the storm could trigger labor in pregnant females who were close to their time. If that was what was happening, then the bear outside wasn't a threat. She was vulnerable. She was going through one of the most difficult experiences any creature could face, and she was doing it alone in the middle of a blizzard. "She's having babies," Lily said, her voice filled with wonder. Ethan looked down at his daughter, surprised that she had come to the same conclusion. But then again, maybe he shouldn't have been surprised. Children often understood things about the natural world that adults had forgotten how to see. They hadn't yet learned to separate themselves from nature, to think of animals as fundamentally different from humans. To Lily, a bear giving birth in a storm was probably not that different from the stories she had heard about her own birth, which had also happened during a storm, though a summer thunderstorm rather than a winter blizzard. They watched in silence for a while, straining to see through the snow. Every now and then, the wind would shift, and they could make out more details. The bear was massive, probably close to 400 pounds, with thick, dark fur that was now covered in snow and ice. She was pressed against the wall of the woodshed, using it to support herself as she dealt with the contractions. Ethan could see her body tense and relax in waves, and each time she tensed, that low rumbling sound would vibrate through the air. It was primal and powerful and somehow beautiful in its raw honesty. This was life at its most fundamental level, stripped of all pretense and civilization. Just a creature bringing new life into the world against all odds. The storm seemed to intensify, as if it was responding to the drama unfolding in its midst. The wind howled louder, and the snow fell thicker, creating an almost solid wall of white between the cabin and the outside world. But Ethan and Lily didn't move from their spot by the window. They were transfixed, held in place by the magnitude of what they were witnessing. It felt like they had been given a privilege, a glimpse into something sacred and secret that few humans ever got to see. The bear didn't know they were watching, or if she did, she was too focused on her task to care. She was entirely absorbed in the ancient rhythm of birth, following instincts that had been passed down through countless generations of her kind. Time lost all meaning as they watched. It could have been minutes or hours. The clock on the mantel continued its steady ticking, but neither Ethan nor Lily looked at it. They were completely present in the moment, their entire world reduced to the view through that frost-covered window. The fire behind them burned lower, the shadows in the room grew longer, but they didn't notice. All that mattered was the drama unfolding outside, the struggle of life against the elements, the determination of a mother to bring her children safely into the world, no matter what obstacles stood in her way. At some point, Lily's hand found Ethan's, and he squeezed it gently. They didn't need to speak. The moment was too profound for words, too important to dilute with unnecessary commentary. They were witnesses to something ancient and eternal. something that connected them to every generation of humans who had ever lived in these mountains, who had ever watched nature unfold its mysteries before their eyes. It was humbling and exhilarating at the same time, making them feel both insignificant and part of something infinitely larger than themselves. The bear's sounds changed, becoming more urgent, more focused. Her whole body seemed to contract, every muscle straining toward a single purpose. And then, in a moment that seemed to stop time itself, they saw it. A tiny form, wet and dark against the snow. The first cub had been born. It was impossibly small compared to its mother, no bigger than a guinea pig, blind and helpless and perfect. The mother bear turned her massive head, her movements surprisingly gentle, and began to clean the cub with her tongue. The tenderness of the gesture was unexpected, a reminder that beneath the fur and claws and tremendous strength, this was a mother caring for her baby, no different in that fundamental way from any human mother. But she wasn't done. Even as she tended to the first cub, her body was already preparing for the next. The contractions continued, visible even from the cabin as ripples across her thick fur. She was exhausted. That much was clear. The effort of giving birth in such conditions was taking everything she had. Her breathing was labored, creating clouds of steam that were immediately whipped away by the wind. But she didn't stop, didn't give up. She couldn't. The ancient imperative to bring forth life was stronger than exhaustion, stronger than the storm, stronger than anything else in that moment. Lily was crying, Ethan realized. Silent tears were rolling down her cheeks as she watched the bear struggle. He understood why. There was something unbearably moving about witnessing such determination, such pure maternal instinct in action. It stripped away all the comfortable barriers humans put between themselves and the rest of the natural world, revealing the fundamental truth that all life was connected. All creatures faced the same basic challenges of survival and reproduction. All mothers loved their children with the same fierce devotion. The second cub came easier than the first, or maybe the bear had found some reserve of strength she didn't know she had. This one was slightly larger, and it moved more when it was born, its tiny limbs already trying to figure out how they worked. The mother cleaned this one too, her large tongue gentle despite its size, warming the cub and stimulating its breathing. She then did something that made both Ethan and Lily gasp. She gathered both cubs against her chest, curling her massive body around them to shield them from the worst of the storm. It was such a human gesture, so recognizable as the universal posture of protection, that for a moment the species barrier seemed to disappear entirely. She was just a mother, doing what mothers do, protecting her children from a harsh world that didn't care about their vulnerability. The storm continued to rage, but something had changed in the atmosphere around the cabin. It felt less threatening now, less like an assault, and more like a backdrop to something more important. The bear settled into her position against the woodshed, her body creating a living cave for her cubs. Every now and then she would shift slightly, adjusting to make sure they were completely covered, completely safe. The cubs were invisible now, hidden beneath their mother's fur, but Ethan and Lily knew they were there, tiny hearts beating, tiny lungs drawing their first breaths of mountain air, beginning their journey in a world that was both beautiful and dangerous, cruel and full of wonder. "We should help them," Lily said, her voice small but determined. Ethan's first instinct was to say no, to explain that wild animals didn't need human help, that interfering could do more harm than good. But looking at his daughter's face, seeing the compassion there, the pure desire to make things better for another living creature, he hesitated. What would be the harm in trying? The bear was exhausted, probably hungry, definitely cold despite her thick fur. And those cubs, so tiny and vulnerable, born into a blizzard that would test even the strongest animals. Maybe there was something they could do, something small but meaningful, to help them through this night. He thought about what they had in the cabin that might be useful. Food was the obvious choice, but bears were dangerous when food was involved, and he didn't want to create an association between humans and food in the bear's mind. That could lead to problems later, both for them and for the bear. But warmth, that was something different. They had extra blankets, old ones that they kept for emergencies. If they could somehow provide some additional insulation for the bear and her cubs, it might make the difference between survival and tragedy. The idea was crazy, he knew that. Approaching a mother bear with newborn cubs was about the most dangerous thing a person could do in these mountains. But something about this night, this storm, this strange intersection of their lives with the bears made normal rules seem less important. "What did you have in mind?" he asked Lily, and her face lit up with surprise and joy that he was even considering it. She ran to her room and came back with her favorite blanket, the one her mother had made for her before she was born. It was thick wool, dyed a deep blue color that reminded Ethan of the sky just after sunset. Lily had slept with it every night since she was a baby, and it carried her scent, her warmth, her love. "We can give her this," she said, holding it out to him. "It's really warm, and it's big enough to help cover the babies." Ethan's heart broke a little at the gesture. That blanket was one of Lily's most precious possessions, one of the few things she had left from her mother, and she was willing to give it to a wild bear she had never seen before tonight, simply because she thought it might help. This was the kind of person his daughter was becoming, generous and brave and kind in ways that humbled him. He wanted to tell her to keep the blanket, that they would find something else, but he could see in her eyes that this was important to her. This was her contribution, her way of being part of something larger than herself. "Okay," he said, taking the blanket from her, "but we have to be really careful. We can't get too close, and if she shows any sign of aggression, we come right back inside. Deal?" Lily nodded solemnly, understanding the seriousness of what they were about to attempt. Ethan went to the closet and pulled out his heavy winter coat, the one he used for checking the property in bad weather. He also grabbed a flashlight, though he wasn't sure how much good it would do in the blizzard. The wind was still howling, and the snow was still falling thick and fast, but there seemed to be a brief lull in the storm's intensity. It was now or never. They stood at the door for a moment, gathering their courage. Once they opened it, they would be committed. The cold would rush in, and more importantly, their scent would rush out. The bear would know they were there, would know humans were close to her and her vulnerable cubs. How she reacted would determine everything that happened next. Ethan put his hand on the door handle, feeling the cold metal even through his glove. He looked down at Lily, bundled in her own winter coat, her face pale but determined. "Stay right behind me," he said. "And if I tell you to run, you run back inside and lock the door. No arguments, promise me." She promised, though he could see she didn't like the idea of leaving him outside alone. He opened the door, and the cold hit them like a physical blow. It was worse than he had expected, a deep, bone-chilling cold that seemed to suck the warmth right out of their bodies. The wind grabbed at their clothes, trying to pull them off balance, and the snow stung their faces like tiny needles. Ethan had to lean into the wind to make any progress, and he felt Lily's small hand grabbed the back of his coat to keep from being separated. They moved slowly, carefully, toward the woodshed. Each step was deliberate, tested before committing their full weight, because the snow had already drifted deep in some places and ice had formed in others. As they got closer, Ethan could see the bear more clearly. She was even larger than he had thought, a magnificent creature despite her exhaustion, Her head was down, resting on her paws, and her eyes were half closed. She looked like she was conserving every bit of energy she had left, focusing entirely on keeping her cubs warm. She had to know they were approaching. Her hearing and smell were far better than any humans, but she didn't move, didn't even lift her head. Either she was too exhausted to care, or she had somehow decided they weren't a threat. Either way, Ethan took it as a good sign. They stopped about 10 feet away, close enough to toss the blanket, but far enough to retreat if necessary. The bear's eyes opened fully then, and she looked directly at them. For a moment that seemed to stretch forever. They stood frozen in tableau, 2 humans and a bear, separated by species and circumstance but united by the storm and the strange magic of this night. The bear's eyes were dark and intelligent, and Ethan could swear he saw recognition there, an understanding that these small, weak creatures were trying to help. It was probably his imagination, probably just projection of human emotions onto an animal, but in that moment it felt real and true. Moving very slowly, telegraphing his intentions, Ethan unfolded the blanket. The wind immediately tried to tear it from his hands, but he held on tight, waiting for the right moment. When the wind died down for just a second, he tossed the blanket toward the bear. It didn't go as far as he had hoped, landing about 3 feet from her, but that was close enough. The bear looked at the blanket, then back at them, and made a sound that wasn't quite a growl but wasn't friendly either. It was more like a warning, a reminder that she was still a wild animal and they should keep their distance. Ethan understood. He took Lily's hand and slowly backed away, never turning his back on the bear until they reached the cabin door. Once inside, they rushed back to the window to watch. The bear hadn't moved at first, but after a few minutes she stretched out one massive paw and hooked the blanket, dragging it closer. She sniffed it thoroughly, probably trying to determine if it was some kind of trap, and then, in a gesture that made Lily clap her hands with joy, she pulled it over her cubs. It wasn't much, that single blanket against the fury of the storm, but it was something. It was a small act of kindness in a world that often seemed short on such things. A bridge between the human world and the wild world. A recognition that compassion could cross any boundary. They watched for a while longer, but the bear seemed to have settled for the night. She was as comfortable as she was going to get. Her cubs were safe beneath her bulk, and the added warmth of Lily's blanket, and the storm would eventually pass. Ethan added more wood to the fire and made fresh hot chocolate for both of them. They sat together on the couch, Lily curled against his side, and talked about what they had seen. Lily had 1,000 questions about bears and cubs and how animals survived in the wild, and Ethan answered as best he could, drawing on half-remembered nature documentaries and articles he had read over the years. But even as they talked, part of their attention remained on the window, on the shadow by the woodshed that represented life persisting against all odds. The storm showed no signs of letting up, but somehow that didn't seem as threatening now. They were all in it together, humans and bears, all just trying to make it through the night. The cabin felt warmer, safer, more like a home than it had in months. Maybe it was the shared experience, the knowledge that they had witnessed something extraordinary and had played a small part in it. Or maybe it was just the reminder that life was precious and fragile and worth protecting, whether it walked on 2 legs or 4. As the night wore on, Lily began to yawn, the excitement and emotion of the evening catching up with her. But she resisted going to bed, not wanting to miss anything that might happen. "What if she needs more help?" she asked, fighting to keep her eyes open. "What if something happens to the babies?" Ethan assured her that bears had been having cubs in storms for thousands of years without human help, that the mother knew what she was doing. But he understood her concern. Once you had made that connection, once you had invested emotionally in another creature's well-being, it was hard to just walk away. Finally, he convinced her to go to bed by promising to check on the bears every hour and wake her if anything important happened. She made him pinky swear their most solemn oath, and then reluctantly went to her room. Ethan tucked her in, noticing the empty space where her blue blanket usually lay. She noticed it too and smiled. "It's keeping the baby bears warm," she said, and the satisfaction in her voice made Ethan's throat tight with emotion. He kissed her forehead and told her how proud he was of her, how brave and kind she had been. She was already half asleep, but she smiled and murmured something about hoping the bears would still be there in the morning. Ethan returned to his vigil by the window. The storm had, if anything, gotten worse. The wind was making sounds he had never heard before, like the mountain itself was protesting this assault on its dignity. But the woodshed was holding strong, and the bear hadn't moved from her position. Every now and then he could see her shift slightly, adjusting her position to better shield her cubs, but otherwise she seemed to be resting. He wondered what she was thinking, if bears thought in any way that humans would recognize. Was she worried about her cubs? Was she planning what to do when the storm passed? Or was she simply existing in the moment, dealing with each challenge as it came without the burden of anticipation that humans carried? The hours passed slowly. Ethan kept his promise to Lily, checking on the bears regularly, though there was little change to report. He made himself coffee and tried to read, but his attention kept drifting back to the window. There was something hypnotic about watching the snow fall, about knowing that just a few feet away, new life was beginning its journey in the world. He thought about his wife, about how much she would have loved this. She had always been fascinated by wildlife, always stopping to watch birds or squirrels or whatever creatures they encountered on their walks. She would have been right there with Lily, probably suggesting they do even more to help the bears. She would have turned it into a teaching moment, explaining about hibernation and adaptation and the interconnectedness of all living things. Around 3 a.m, something changed. The wind, which had been constant for hours, suddenly died down to almost nothing. The snow continued to fall, but gently now, like it was apologizing for its earlier violence. In the relative quiet, Ethan could hear other sounds: the crack of tree branches breaking under the weight of snow, the distant rumble of what might have been an avalanche higher up the mountain. And from the woodshed, a new sound: tiny squeaks and mewls that could only be coming from the cubs. They had survived the night. They were alive and apparently vocal about it. The mother bear lifted her head at the sounds, and even from the cabin, Ethan could see her checking on them, making sure they were okay. He wanted to wake Lily to share this moment, but he let her sleep. She would have plenty of time to see the cubs in the morning, assuming the bears were still there. For now, he enjoyed the solitary pleasure of knowing that their small act of kindness had, maybe, just maybe, made a difference. The blanket was still draped over part of the bear, providing an extra layer of protection against the cold. It was such a small thing in the grand scheme of nature, but it represented something important. It represented the choice to help rather than hide, to extend compassion beyond the boundaries of species, to recognize that all life had value and deserved protection when possible. Chapter 2. The Silent Watch. The first light of dawn came slowly, reluctantly, as if the sun itself was hesitant to witness what the storm had done to the mountain. The snow had finally stopped falling, but everything was buried under a thick white blanket that transformed the familiar landscape into something alien and beautiful. Trees that had stood tall and proud were now bent nearly to breaking. Their branches weighted down with more snow than seemed possible. The woodshed was almost invisible. just a white mound with dark gaps where the structure showed through. And there, still pressed against its wall, was the bear. Ethan had dozed off in his chair by the window, but he woke instantly when he heard Lily's door open. She padded out in her pajamas and socks, her hair wild from sleep, but her eyes immediately alert and focused on the window. "Are they still there?" she whispered, as if speaking too loudly might scare them away. Ethan nodded and moved over to make room for her on the chair. Together, they watched as the morning light gradually revealed more details of the scene outside. The bear looked different in daylight. Her fur, which had seemed uniformly dark in the night, was actually a rich brown with hints of gold where the weak sunlight touched it. She was absolutely massive, even larger than Ethan had estimated, but there was a grace to her size, a rightness to it that spoke of perfect adaptation to this environment. She was awake, they could tell by the way her head moved slightly, tracking something they couldn't see. Maybe she was watching the trees for danger, or maybe she was just taking in the changed world around her. The cubs were invisible beneath her bulk, but occasionally they could see movement, a tiny paw or nose poking out before quickly disappearing again. The blue blanket was still there, now covered with a layer of snow, but still providing whatever warmth it could. The bear had actually pulled it closer during the night, tucking it around herself in a way that seemed almost human in its deliberateness. "She kept it," Lily said, her voice full of wonder and pride. "She knew we were trying to help." Ethan wanted to caution her about anthropomorphizing animal behavior, about reading human emotions into animal actions, but he stopped himself. Maybe she was right. Maybe the bear did understand on some level that the blanket was a gift, an offering of aid from one mother to another. Because that's what Lily was doing, wasn't she? She was channeling her mother's spirit, carrying on that tradition of kindness and compassion that had defined their family before tragedy had reshaped it. The blanket had been made by her mother's hands, and now it was protecting new life in the wilderness. There was poetry in that, a continuity that transcended death and species boundaries. They made breakfast quietly, not wanting to disturb the peaceful scene outside. Oatmeal with dried berries and honey, toast made on the stovetop since the power had gone out sometime during the night. They ate standing at the window, unable to tear themselves away from the unfolding drama. The bear had begun to move more, shifting her position to allow the cubs better access to Nurse. For the first time, they got a clear view of the tiny creatures. There were indeed 2 of them, impossibly small against their mother's massive frame. They were dark, like her, but with lighter markings around their faces that made them look like they were wearing masks. Their eyes weren't open yet, and they moved with the uncoordinated movements of all newborns, but they were clearly strong and healthy. "They're perfect," Lily breathed, pressing her hands against the glass. "Look how tiny their paws are, and their ears. They're like little teddy bears." She was right. There was something almost toy-like about them, something that triggered every protective instinct in both father and daughter. It was hard to reconcile these tiny, vulnerable creatures with the massive predators they would become, assuming they survived. That was the big question, wasn't it? The storm had passed, but winter was far from over. The mother would need to find food soon, and shelter better than a woodshed wall. The cubs would need to grow quickly, to develop the fat reserves and thick fur that would protect them from the cold. So many things could go wrong, so many challenges lay ahead. As if sensing their thoughts, the mother bear began to stir more purposefully. She rose to her feet slowly, carefully, making sure the cubs were secure against her chest. They clung to her fur with tiny claws, instinctively knowing that letting go meant danger. She stood there for a moment, swaying slightly, probably stiff from spending the night in one position. Then she turned her massive head and looked directly at the cabin, directly at Ethan and Lily watching from the window. It was a long look, steady and unblinking, and it felt like an acknowledgement. Like she was saying goodbye, or thank you, or simply noting their presence in this shared moment. "Is she leaving?" Lily asked, and there was sadness in her voice. She had become attached to these bears in just one night, had invested her heart in their survival and well-being. The thought of them leaving, of not knowing what happened to them, was clearly painful for her. Ethan understood. He felt it too, that strange connection that had formed during the storm. But he also knew this was how it had to be. The bears belonged to the wild, and the wild was not a place for human sentiment or intervention beyond what they had already done. The bear took a step away from the woodshed, then another. The snow was deep, coming up to her chest in some places, and she had to push through it like a living snowplow. But she was strong, built for this environment, and she made steady progress. Every few steps she would pause and check on the cubs, making sure they were still secure. The blue blanket fell away as she moved, landing in the snow like a forgotten flag. Lily made a small sound of disappointment, but then the bear did something extraordinary. She stopped, turned back, and picked up the blanket in her mouth. She carried it for several steps before dropping it again, and this time she deliberately pushed a snow over it with her massive paw, partially burying it. "She's hiding it," Ethan said, amazed. "She's saving it for later." It was the kind of behavior that wildlife biologists would probably say was impossible, that bears didn't plan ahead like that, didn't save objects for future use. But he had seen it with his own eyes, and so had Lily. The bear had recognized the blanket as something valuable, something worth preserving, and had cached it like she might cache food. It was a behavior that suggested a level of intelligence and planning that most people didn't associate with bears. They watched as the bear continued her journey, moving steadily away from the cabin and into the forest. Her path was deliberate, like she knew exactly where she was going. Maybe she had a den nearby, a proper shelter where she could raise her cubs in relative safety. Or maybe she was just following instinct, moving away from the human scent and toward something that felt more like home. The trees swallowed her up gradually, her dark form becoming harder and harder to distinguish among the shadows and snow-covered branches. Just before she disappeared completely, she stopped one more time and looked back. It was too far to see her expression, but Lily waved anyway, a small, hopeful gesture of farewell. And then she was gone. The clearing around the cabin suddenly seemed empty, ordinary, like the magic that had filled it during the night had departed with the bears. The only evidence that anything extraordinary had happened was the disturbed snow by the woodshed and the small corner of blue fabric still visible where the bear had buried the blanket. Lily stood at the window for a long time after the bears had disappeared, as if willing them to come back. Ethan could see her processing the experience, trying to understand what it meant, how it fit into her understanding of the world. "Do you think we'll ever see them again?" she asked finally. Ethan considered lying, telling her that of course they would, that the bears would come back to visit. But Lily deserved better than comfortable lies. "I don't know," he said honestly. "Probably not. Bears have large territories and they don't usually stay in one place for long. But maybe, if we're really lucky, we might see them from a distance sometime. Or maybe we'll see signs of them, tracks or markings that let us know they're okay." Lily nodded, accepting this uncertainty with more grace than most adults would have managed. The rest of the morning was spent in a strange kind of limbo. They couldn't leave the cabin because the snow was too deep and the roads would be impassable for days. But they also couldn't quite return to normal activities. The experience of the night had changed something, had shifted their perspective in a way that made ordinary concerns seem less important. They tried to read, to play games, to do the things they usually did when stuck inside, but their attention kept drifting back to the window, to the place where the bears had been. Around noon, something unexpected happened. They heard a sound outside, a scratching and snuffling that made them both rush to the window. It wasn't the bears, but it was almost as surprising. A fox, red as flame against the white snow, was investigating the spot where the bears had sheltered. It sniffed around carefully, probably trying to understand the mix of scents, bear and human, and something else, the scent of birth and new life. The fox seemed particularly interested in the buried blanket, pawing at the snow above it but not quite brave enough to uncover it completely. "He knows something important happened here," Lily said, and Ethan had to agree. Animals had ways of communicating that humans didn't fully understand. Scent markers and body language, and sounds below the range of human hearing. The fox probably knew the whole story just from the smells left behind, knew that a bear had given birth here, that humans had been involved somehow, that something unusual had occurred during the storm. After a few minutes of investigation, the fox moved on, but its visit felt like a validation somehow, a confirmation that what had happened was significant not just to them but to the forest itself. The afternoon brought more visitors. Birds, mostly, chickadees and nuthatches that were brave enough to venture out after the storm. They seemed drawn to the woodshed area too, pecking at the disturbed snow, finding seeds or insects that had been exposed. A squirrel appeared briefly, chattering at them through the window as if asking what all the fuss was about. The wildlife that had been hidden during the storm was emerging, reclaiming the forest, returning to their normal patterns. But they all seemed to pause at that spot by the woodshed, as if paying respects to what had occurred there. Lily spent the afternoon drawing. She had always been artistic, another trait inherited from her mother, and she wanted to capture the memory before it faded. She drew the bear first, trying to get the massive size and the gentle eyes right. Then the cubs, tiny and perfect, nestled against their mother. She drew the storm, wild lines of pencil representing the wind and snow. And finally, she drew herself and Ethan, standing in the snow with the blanket, two small figures in a big, wild world. The drawings were childish in technique, but sophisticated in emotion, capturing something essential about the experience that a photograph never could have. As evening approached, the quality of light began to change, taking on the golden hue that photographers called the magic hour. It transformed the snowy landscape into something from a fairy tale, all golden highlights and blue shadows. Ethan was preparing dinner when Lily suddenly gasped and pressed her face against the window. "Dad, look!" He rushed over, expecting to see the bears returning, but it was something else entirely. There, at the edge of the forest, barely visible in the fading light, was a line of tracks. Fresh tracks, too recent to have been filled in by blowing snow. They led from the forest to the woodshed and then back. A high sea, deliberate path that suggested purpose rather than random wandering. They grabbed the binoculars and took turns studying the tracks. They were definitely bear tracks, the size and shape unmistakable. But there was something odd about them. They seemed to circle the spot where the blanket was buried, and there were marks in the snow that suggested digging. "She came back," Lily whispered, her voice full of awe. "She came back for the blanket." They couldn't be sure, of course. It could have been a different bear, or the tracks could be older than they looked, distorted by wind and settling snow. But in their hearts they knew. The mother had returned, probably after finding a safe place for her cubs, and had retrieved the blanket. It was a thought that filled them both with a deep satisfaction. The blanket, that symbol of human kindness and connection, was now part of the bear's story. Maybe it was lining a den somewhere, providing extra warmth for the cubs as they grew. Maybe the mother would keep it for years, a strange artifact of the night her children were born. Or maybe she would abandon it eventually, and some hiker would find it years from now and wonder how a hand-knitted blue blanket ended up in the middle of the wilderness. Either way, it had served its purpose. It had been a bridge between worlds, a gesture of compassion that transcended species boundaries. That night, as they prepared for bed, the cabin felt different. It wasn't just a shelter anymore, a place to stay warm and safe from the elements. It was part of something larger, connected to the forest and the mountains in a way it hadn't been before. The walls that separated inside from outside, civilization from wilderness, seemed thinner, more permeable. They could feel the presence of the wild world just beyond their door, not as a threat but as a neighbor, sharing the same space, facing the same challenges, living parallel lives that occasionally, miraculously, intersected. Lily asked to sleep in the living room that night on the couch where she could see out the window. Ethan understood. She didn't want to miss anything, didn't want to close her eyes on this day that had been so full of wonder. He made up a bed for her on the couch, bringing pillows and her second favorite blanket, the one with stars on it that she usually used for camping trips. She settled in, her face turned toward the window, watching the darkness that had swallowed the forest. "Do you think they're warm enough?" she asked as Ethan tucked her in. "Do you think the babies are okay?" "I think they're exactly where they need to be," Ethan told her. "Their mother knows how to take care of them. She's been preparing for this for months, finding the perfect den, building up her strength. And now she has your blanket, too, extra warmth for extra cold nights. They're going to be fine." Lily smiled at that, comforted by the thought that her gift was still helping, even if she couldn't see it. She closed her eyes, but Ethan could tell she wasn't sleeping yet. She was thinking, processing, incorporating this experience into her understanding of the world. He sat with her for a while, watching her face relax into sleep, listening to her breathing sync with the quiet sounds of the cabin settling for the night. Outside, the moon had risen, full and bright, turning the snow-covered landscape into a monochrome masterpiece. He could see every tree, every drift, every shadow in sharp detail. And there, by the woodshed, he could still make out the depression where the bear had sheltered, the disturbed snow where life had entered the world against all odds. It looked like a shrine almost, a sacred spot marked by the universe as significant. He thought about his wife again, about how she would have interpreted this experience. She had always believed in signs, in messages from the universe, in the idea that everything happened for a reason. He had been more skeptical, more inclined to see coincidence where she saw meaning. But this felt different. This felt like something she might have arranged if such things were possible. A lesson for Lily about compassion and courage. A reminder for him that wonder and magic still existed in the world. A connection between their small family and the larger family of life that surrounded them. Maybe he was reading too much into it, but maybe that didn't matter. Maybe the meaning was in the interpretation, in the choice to see significance rather than coincidence. The clock on the mantel chimed midnight, and Ethan realized he had been sitting there for hours, lost in thought. He stood carefully, not wanting to wake Lily, and moved to the window for one last look. The forest was still and silent, the kind of deep quiet that only came after a major storm when even the wind seemed exhausted. But it didn't feel empty. It felt full of hidden life, of creatures settled in their dens and nests, of bears curled around their cubs, of the slow pulse of winter survival that would continue until spring brought relief. Somewhere out there, two tiny cubs were beginning their journey through life, carrying with them the warmth of a gift freely given, a connection made across the vast divide between wild and domestic, animal and human. He checked the doors, made sure the fire was safely banked, and prepared for bed himself. But before he left the living room, he paused at the couch where Lily slept. She had kicked off her blanket, and he carefully covered her again. In her sleep, she smiled and murmured something he couldn't quite catch. Maybe she was dreaming about the bears, about running with them through the forest, about a world where such connections were common rather than extraordinary. He hoped so. He hoped she would carry this memory with her always, this proof that kindness mattered, that small actions could have profound impacts, that the world was full of wonder if you just knew how to look for it. The cabin settled into nighttime quiet, just the tick of the clock and the occasional pop from the cooling stove. Outside, the moon continued its journey across the sky, and the snow continued its slow settling. And somewhere in the forest, a mother bear curled protectively around her cubs, a blue blanket adding its warmth to her own. It was a scene repeated countless times throughout history, the cycle of birth and survival and growth that connected all living things. But tonight, for this father and daughter, it felt unique and precious, a gift from the universe that they would treasure always. Morning would come, and with it the gradual return to normal life. The roads would be cleared, power would be restored, and the outside world would intrude again with its demands and distractions. But something had changed during this storm, something fundamental about how they saw their place in the world. They were not separate from nature, but part of it, connected to every creature that shared these mountains. The bears had taught them that, had shown them that compassion and wonder were not just human traits, but universal ones, written into the very fabric of life itself. As Ethan finally headed to his own bed, he stopped one more time at the window. The moon had illuminated fresh tracks in the snow, too far away to identify but clearly from something large. Maybe it was the bears, checking on their old shelter one more time. Maybe it was a different animal altogether, drawn by some invisible signal to this place where something remarkable had happened. Or maybe it was just his imagination, seeing patterns where none existed. It didn't matter. What mattered was that they had been given a gift, a glimpse into the secret life of the forest, a chance to participate in something ancient and sacred. And they had risen to the occasion, had chosen kindness over fear, connection over separation. The tracks disappeared into the forest, leading toward mysteries they would never solve, stories they would never know. But that was okay. Some things were meant to remain wild and unknowable, keeping their secrets while reminding humans that they were not the only important actors on this stage. The bears would live their lives, the cubs would grow, and maybe someday, years from now, Lily would be walking in the forest and come across a massive bear with two younger ones, and there would be a moment of recognition, a flash of connection that transcended time and memory. Or maybe not. Maybe this was their only intersection, this one perfect night when the boundaries between worlds grew thin and miracles became possible. Either way, they had been changed by it. They had touched wildness and been touched by it in return. They had learned that kindness was not weakness, but strength, that compassion could bridge any gap, that even in the harshest conditions, life found a way to continue. These were lessons worth learning, worth carrying forward into whatever challenges lay ahead. The storm had brought more than snow and wind. It had brought transformation, connection, and a story that would be told and retold, growing richer with each telling, becoming part of the family mythology that would be passed down through generations. The years had a way of moving both slowly and quickly at the same time. Lily grew taller, her face lost its roundness, and her questions became more complex, but her eyes remained the same. Those green eyes that saw magic in ordinary things, that looked for connections where others saw only random events. The cabin remained their winter retreat, a place they returned to every year when the snow began to fall, and the world became quiet. And every year, without fail, they would stand at the window and look toward the woodshed, remembering that night when the boundaries between worlds had grown thin. It was 5 winters later when everything changed again. Lily was 12 now, all gangly limbs and newfound independence, but still carrying that core of compassion that defined her. They had arrived at the cabin earlier than usual that year, beating the first major storm by just a few days. The weather forecasters were predicting another big one, similar to the one from that memorable night, and Ethan wanted to make sure they were properly prepared. They spent the first day checking supplies, stacking extra firewood, and making sure the generator was working properly. Technology had improved in the intervening years, and they now had better communication equipment, solar panels for backup power, and even a satellite phone for emergencies. But despite all these modern additions, the cabin retained its essential character, that feeling of being a bridge between civilization and wilderness. On their second night there, just as the storm was beginning to build, Lily heard something outside. It wasn't the wind this time, though that was starting to pick up. It was a deliberate sound, something moving through the snow with purpose. She was at the window before Ethan could even get up from his chair, her face pressed against the glass just like it had been 5 years ago. "Dad," she whispered, and there was something in her voice that made him move quickly to join her. "Look at the woodshed." There was a bear there, not just any bear, but a massive female, with distinctive markings around her face. Scars, now that hadn't been there before, but in the same pattern as those lighter patches they had seen on the cubs years ago. She was investigating the woodshed, sniffing around the exact spot where she had sheltered during that long-ago storm. But she wasn't alone. Behind her, keeping a respectful distance but clearly with her, were 2 younger bears. They were about half her size, clearly adolescents, with the same distinctive facial markings. They moved with the awkward grace of teenagers, not quite comfortable in their growing bodies, but showing hints of the power they would soon possess. "It's them," Lily breathed. And Ethan couldn't disagree. The odds were astronomical. The chances of the same bears returning to the exact same spot after all these years were virtually impossible. But the evidence was right in front of them. The mother bear was older, showing the wear of 5 hard winters, but she moved with the same deliberate grace they remembered. And those 2 younger bears, they had to be the cubs, now grown but still following their mother, still learning the ways of survival in these mountains. The mother bear did something then that removed any doubt from their minds. She went to a specific spot near the woodshed and began to dig through the snow. It took Ethan a moment to realize what she was doing, but Lily understood immediately. "She's looking for the blanket," she said, her voice full of wonder. "She remembers." Of course, the blanket was long gone, either rotted away or carried off by other animals over the years. But the bear continued to dig for a few moments before stopping and sitting back on her haunches, looking almost contemplative. Then she did something that made both Ethan and Lily gasp. She turned and looked directly at the cabin, directly at the window where they stood watching. It was the same steady, knowing look from 5 years ago, but this time there was something else in it. Recognition. She knew this place, knew that humans lived here, knew that this was where help had come from during her time of greatest need. The younger bears seemed nervous about being so close to human habitation. They made small sounds of anxiety, shifting their weight from foot to foot, clearly wanting to leave. But the mother held her ground for a moment longer, as if she was remembering, or perhaps showing her offspring where they had been born, where their story had begun. It was anthropomorphism, Ethan knew, to read such complex emotions into animal behavior. But he couldn't shake the feeling that this was exactly what was happening. This was a pilgrimage of sorts, a return to a place of significance. Lily was already moving, heading for her room with purpose. She came back with something in her hands, and Ethan's throat tightened when he saw what it was. Another blanket, this one red, that she had been working on for the past year. She had learned to knit from YouTube videos and library books, determined to master the skill that her mother had possessed. This blanket was her first successful project. Not perfect by any means, with dropped stitches here and there and tension that varied from row to row, but made with love and determination. "I want to give them this," she said, and there was no question in her voice, just statement of fact. Ethan wanted to say no, wanted to explain that they couldn't keep giving blankets to bears, that it would create a dangerous dependency, that wildlife needed to remain wild. But looking at his daughter's face, seeing the certainty there, he couldn't bring himself to deny her this. The bears were already here, had already made the choice to return to this place. One more blanket wouldn't change the fundamental nature of their relationship with the wilderness. And maybe, just maybe, this was how the story was supposed to continue, with gifts given freely across the years, connections maintained despite the vast differences between their worlds. They bundled up against the growing storm, though it wasn't nearly as fierce as that night 5 years ago. The bears watched them exit the cabin, the mother calm but alert, the adolescents clearly nervous and ready to flee. Ethan and Lily stopped about 20 feet away, much farther than they had been that first time, respecting the increased danger that the younger bears represented. Adolescent bears were unpredictable, more likely to react aggressively if startled or threatened, but the mother seemed to understand their intentions. She made a low sound, not quite a growl, but clearly a communication to her offspring, and they settled slightly, though they remained watchful. Lily unfolded the red blanket slowly, letting the bears see what it was. The wind tried to grab it, but she held on tight, waiting for the right moment. When she tossed it, it landed perfectly, just a few feet from the mother bear. The bear approached it slowly, sniffing carefully, and then something remarkable happened. One of the adolescents, the slightly smaller one, approached as well. It sniffed the blanket, then looked at its mother as if asking permission. The mother made another sound, softer this time, and the young bear grabbed the blanket in its mouth. What happened next would stay with Ethan and Lily forever. The young bear didn't drag the blanket away or play with it as a toy. Instead, it carried it carefully to a spot near the woodshed and began to arrange it, pushing snow over the edges just as its mother had done years before. It was a learned behavior, passed down from mother to offspring, a tradition that had begun with a blue blanket on a stormy night and was now continuing with a red one. The mother bear watched approvingly, and then, as if satisfied that the lesson had been properly demonstrated, she turned to leave. But before she disappeared into the forest, she did one more thing. She approached the spot where she had given birth, where she had spent that terrible and wonderful night 5 years ago, and she stood there for a long moment. Then she placed one massive paw on the ground and pressed down hard, leaving a deep print in the snow. It was deliberate, intentional, like she was signing her name, leaving proof that she had been here, that this place mattered. The younger bears followed her lead, each leaving their own prints beside hers, a family signature that would last until the next snowfall erased it. They watched the bears disappear into the forest, moving with more confidence than they had 5 years ago, knowing exactly where they were going. The storm was building, but it felt different this time, less threatening, and more like nature's way of drawing a curtain on this chapter of the story. Ethan and Lily stood in the snow for a while longer, looking at the prints, at the carefully buried blanket, at the physical evidence of this impossible reunion. Then they went back inside, where the warmth of the cabin embraced them like an old friend. They didn't talk much that night. There wasn't much to say that wouldn't diminish what they had experienced. Instead, they sat by the fire, Lily working on a new knitting project. This one, a scarf in green wool, while Ethan read and occasionally looked up to watch the snow fall. The storm passed through quickly, leaving only a few inches of new snow, nothing like that epic blizzard from years before. In the morning, they could still see the bear prints and the corner of the red blanket where the young bear had buried it. But there were also new tracks, fox and rabbit, and what might have been a mountain lion, all investigating this strange shrine that the bears had created. Over the next few days, they settled into their usual cabin routine, but everything felt charged with extra meaning. Every sound outside made them look up hopefully, wondering if the bears might return. They didn't, but other animals seemed drawn to the cabin that year. A family of foxes took up residence under the woodshed, their red fur bright against the snow. A pair of wolves passed through one evening, pausing to howl at the moon in a way that made Lily's eyes shine with delight. Even a moose wandered into the clearing one morning, massive and magnificent, browsing on the bushes that poked through the snow. It was as if word had gotten out in the animal kingdom that this was a safe place, a place where the usual rules of separation between human and wild didn't quite apply. On their last night at the cabin that year, something extraordinary happened. They were packing up, preparing to return to their regular lives, when Lily noticed something outside. The moon was full, casting everything in silver light, and there, at the edge of the forest, was a gathering of animals. The bear family was there, keeping to the shadows but clearly visible. The foxes were there too, sitting alert and watchful. An owl perched in a nearby tree, and they could see the eye shine of other creatures they couldn't identify. They weren't doing anything, just being there, present at the border between forest and clearing, wild and domestic. "It's like they're saying goodbye," Lily whispered, and maybe she was right. Maybe this was the forest's way of acknowledging the connection that had been forged, the bridge that had been built through acts of kindness and respect. They stood at the window for a long time, humans on one side of the glass, wilderness on the other, but somehow united in that moment. Then, as if by some signal, all the animals began to disperse. The bears melted back into the forest. The foxes darted away. The owl spread its wings and vanished into the night. Within minutes, the clearing was empty again, returned to its normal state. But something remained. Not just the blanket buried in the snow, not just the tracks and signs of passage, but something less tangible and more important. A knowledge that connection was possible, that kindness could transcend any boundary, that the world was full of magic if you knew how to see it. They left the cabin the next morning, but they carried that knowledge with them, and it colored everything that came after. Lily became involved in wildlife conservation, eventually studying biology in college and specializing in bear behavior. She would tell the story of that night to her professors and classmates, some of whom believed her and some who didn't, but all of whom were moved by her passion and conviction. Years passed. Ethan grew older, his hair turning gray and then white, but he never stopped returning to the cabin each winter. Sometimes Lily came with him when her schedule allowed, and they would stand at the window and remember. The woodshed eventually needed to be rebuilt. damaged by years of weather and the attention of various animals who seemed drawn to it. When they took it apart, they found remnants of fabric worked into the wood, blue and red threads that had somehow become part of the structure itself. They saved these fragments, pressing them between glass and framing them, physical proof of a story that seemed too magical to be true. Lily got married in the clearing beside the cabin on a perfect summer day when the mountains were green and the air was sweet with pine and wildflowers. As she exchanged vows with her partner, a person who understood and cherished her connection to the wild, a bear appeared at the edge of the forest. It was massive, clearly elderly, moving with the careful dignity of age. It watched the ceremony for a moment, then turned and disappeared back into the trees. The guests assumed it was coincidence, a random wildlife sighting that added color to the day. But Lily and Ethan knew better. They knew it was the mother bear, now in the last years of her life, coming to witness another important moment, to acknowledge that the connection between their families continued. The cycle continued in ways both expected and surprising. Lily had children of her own, twins as it happened, a boy and a girl who inherited their mother's green eyes and her way of seeing wonder in the world. She brought them to the cabin when they were old enough, told them the story of the bears and the blankets, showed them the framed threads and the photographs she had taken over the years of various animals near the woodshed. They listened with the rapt attention that children give to stories that might be true, that exist in that magical space between fact and fairy tale. One winter, when the twins were 7, the same age Lily had been during that first encounter, they experienced their own moment of magic. A young bear, clearly pregnant, and struggling through a sudden storm, took shelter by the rebuilt woodshed. Without prompting, without being asked, the twins went to their room and brought out their own blankets, ones their grandmother had made before she died, infused with love and memory. They wanted to help, to continue the tradition, to be part of the story. And so it happened again, the careful approach, the offered gift, the acceptance and acknowledgement between species. But this time there was something different. As they placed the blankets near the bear, the wind died down for a moment, and in that sudden silence they heard it. Other bears calling from the forest. The pregnant bear lifted her head and called back, and within minutes 2 other bears emerged from the trees. They were both female, both young, and they approached the pregnant bear with obvious familiarity. Sisters, perhaps, or cousins, part of a family group that had learned to work together. They surrounded the pregnant bear, sharing body heat, creating a living shelter against the storm. Watching from the window, Lily felt tears on her cheeks. The bears had learned, had adapted, had incorporated human kindness into their survival strategy. But more than that, they had taught each other, passed down the knowledge that this place, this cabin, these humans, could be trusted. It was evolution in real time, not genetic but cultural, the development of traditions and behaviors that transcended instinct. The blankets were no longer just gifts, but part of a larger story, a multi-generational saga of connection and mutual aid. The pregnant bear gave birth that night, to 3 cubs this time, while her sisters stood guard and the storm raged overhead. The twins watched in awe, experiencing the same wonder their mother had felt all those years ago. And when morning came and the bears prepared to leave, each of them touched the ground in front of the woodshed, leaving their prints in a deliberate pattern. It was like a guest book, a record of who had been there and when, a physical manifestation of the ongoing relationship between the cabin and the forest. As the years continued to pass, the story grew and evolved. Scientists became interested when Lily published a paper about learned behavior in bear populations, using her family's experiences as a case study. Some were skeptical, But when they set up cameras around the cabin, they captured footage that amazed even the doubters. Bears returning to the same spot year after year, sometimes in groups, sometimes alone, but always showing behaviors that suggested memory and cultural transmission. The blanket-burying behavior had spread to other bears in the area, becoming a local tradition that no one fully understood, but everyone found fascinating. The cabin became something of a research station, though Ethan insisted it remain primarily a family home. Scientists came to observe, to study, to try to understand what was happening, but they all agreed that the key element wasn't something that could be measured or quantified. It was the intention behind the original act, the pure compassion of a child wanting to help, that had somehow created a ripple effect through the ecosystem. The bears weren't the only animals affected. The whole forest around the cabin seemed different, more alive, more interconnected, as if that first act of kindness had awakened something that had always been there, but had been dormant. Ethan lived to see his great-grandchildren take their turn at the window, watching new generations of bears navigate storms and challenges with the help of freely given blankets. He passed away peacefully one winter night, with snow falling gently outside and the sound of animals moving through the forest. At his memorial service, held in the clearing beside the cabin, bears appeared again. Not just one or two, but a whole gathering, mothers and cubs and adolescents, sitting at the forest edge like mourners, paying their respects. They stayed for the entire service, then melted back into the trees, leaving only tracks to prove they had been there. The tradition continued, would continue, as long as there were people in the cabin who remembered the story and honored its lesson. That kindness created connections that transcended species and generations. That small acts could have profound consequences. That the world was full of magic and wonder for those who approached it with open hearts and helping hands. The blankets continued to be given, continued to be buried and retrieved, continued to warm cubs through cold winters. And each time, the bond between human and wild grew stronger, more complex, more beautiful. Scientists would eventually document what they called the cabin effect, the measurable increase in cross-species cooperation and communication in the area around the cabin. They would write papers and give presentations, trying to explain in scientific terms what was essentially a miracle of compassion. But for the family, for Lily and her children and their children, it remained simpler than that. It was just the story of a night when a little girl wanted to help, when a father chose kindness over fear, when a mother bear accepted a gift from strangers. It was proof that love was the most powerful force in the universe, capable of bridging any gap, healing any wound, creating connections that lasted forever. The red blanket that the adolescent bear had buried was eventually found, years later, incorporated into a den high up the mountain. It was weathered and faded but still intact, woven into a nest with branches and grass and other materials. Cubs had been born on it, had taken their first breaths wrapped in its warmth. It had become part of the forest, part of the story of the mountains, a human artifact transformed into something wild and sacred. When Lily saw it, during a hiking expedition with her graduate students, she didn't retrieve it. It belonged to the forest now, to the bears, to the ongoing story that had no end. There was one final mystery that emerged over the years. Every spring, when the snow melted, they would find things at the base of the woodshed. Pine cones arranged in patterns, interesting rocks, once even an antler shed by a deer. At first, they thought it was coincidence, random accumulation of forest debris. But the patterns were too deliberate, the objects too carefully chosen. The bears were leaving gifts of their own, reciprocating in the only way they could, with treasures from their world offered to the humans who had shown them kindness. The exchange became formalized over time. The family would leave blankets and occasionally other useful items, things that could help the bears through harsh weather or difficult times. The bears would leave natural objects, things of beauty or interest that they seemed to think humans would appreciate. It was commerce of the heart, trade based on mutual respect and affection rather than need or profit. Each side gave what they had in abundance and received what they couldn't create themselves. The blankets provided warmth and comfort. The forest gifts provided wonder and connection to the wild world. One particular gift stood out among all the others. It was a stone, smooth and round, with veins of quartz running through it that caught the light in remarkable ways. It was too perfect to be random, clearly chosen with care and intention. It appeared at the woodshed on the 5th anniversary of that first encounter, left in the exact spot where the mother bear had given birth. When Lily picked it up, it was still warm, as if it had been carried in a mouth for a long distance, protected and transported with purpose. She had it analyzed by a geologist friend, who told her it wasn't local, that it came from much higher up the mountain, from a place humans rarely went. The bear had traveled far to find this particular stone, had carried it down through difficult terrain, had left it as a message or a thank you or simply an acknowledgement of connection. That stone became the family's most treasured possession, passed down from parent to child along with the story of its origin. It sat on the mantel above the fireplace, catching the light during the day, seeming to glow with its own inner fire at night. Children would hold it while listening to the story of the bears, feeling its smooth surface worn even smoother by generations of handling. It was tangible proof of something intangible, evidence of a relationship that shouldn't exist but did, a bridge between worlds that had been built with blankets and maintained with mutual respect. The story spread beyond the family, beyond the scientific community, becoming something of a legend in the region. People would come to the area hoping to see the bears, to witness the magic for themselves. Most were disappointed, seeing only ordinary wildlife behaving in ordinary ways. Because the magic wasn't in the bears themselves, or in the cabin, or even in the blankets. It was in the intention, in the choice to help without expectation of reward, in the recognition that all life was connected and valuable. Those who came looking for spectacle missed the point entirely. Those who came with open hearts and genuine desire to understand sometimes experienced their own moments of connection, their own glimpses of the deeper truth. As Lily grew older, she spent more and more time at the cabin, eventually retiring there permanently. She continued the tradition, teaching her grandchildren and then their children how to approach wildlife with respect and compassion, how to offer help without creating dependency, how to see the sacred in the ordinary. She documented every encounter, every gift exchanged, every new behavior observed, creating a record that would outlast her, that would ensure the story continued even when those who had lived it were gone. On her final winter at the cabin, when she was very old and knew her time was coming to an end, something extraordinary happened. Bears came from all over the mountain, dozens of them, gathering in the clearing around the cabin. They didn't do anything, just sat in the snow, waiting, watching. Some were descendants of that first mother bear, carrying her genes and her memories. Others were strangers, drawn by something they couldn't understand but couldn't resist. They stayed for 3 days and nights, a vigil that moved everyone who witnessed it. When Lily passed, peacefully in her sleep with snow falling outside and her family around her, the bears stood as one and walked to the woodshed. Each one touched the ground there, leaving their mark, their signature, their acknowledgement of a life that had changed their world. Then they returned to the forest, disappearing into the trees like ghosts, leaving only their prints as proof they had been there. The prints formed a pattern, almost like writing, a message in a language that humans couldn't read but somehow understood. It said, "Thank you." It said, "Goodbye." It said, "The story continues." The cabin still stands, still serves as a bridge between worlds. The family still visits, still maintains the tradition, still leaves blankets for bears in need. And the bears still come, still remember, still leave their gifts of pine cones and stones. The scientists have mostly given up trying to explain it, acknowledging that some things exist outside the realm of traditional understanding. The locals have incorporated it into their mythology, another layer in the rich tapestry of mountain folklore. But for those who know the true story, who have stood at the window and witnessed the magic for themselves, it remains what it always was. A simple tale of kindness rewarded, of connections that transcend species, of the power of compassion to change the world one small act at a time. The stone still sits on the mantel, still catches the light, still holds within its crystalline structure the memory of that first night when everything changed. Children still hold it while listening to the story, still feel the warmth that seems to emanate from its core. And sometimes, on nights when the moon is full and the snow is falling, if you look carefully out the window, you can see them. Shadows moving through the forest, large and small. A family of bears making their pilgrimage to the place where their story began. They come to remember, to honor, to continue a tradition that has become as much a part of their culture as it has the humans who started it. The blue blanket, the original one, was never found again. Perhaps it disintegrated, returning to the earth from which its wool had come. Perhaps it still exists somewhere, hidden in a den so remote that humans will never find it, a sacred relic of that first encounter. Or perhaps it became something else entirely, transformed by time and weather and the magic of the mountains into something beyond physical existence. A spirit of kindness that pervades the forest, encouraging other acts of compassion, other bridges between worlds. The family likes to think that every time a human helps an animal, or an animal shows trust in a human, a thread from that blanket is there, invisible but present, connecting all acts of kindness in an endless web of compassion. The tradition has spread beyond the cabin now. Other families in other places have begun their own versions, leaving blankets for wildlife in need, creating their own bridges between domestic and wild. Not all are successful. The magic can't be forced or manufactured. It has to arise naturally from genuine compassion and respect. But when it does work, when connections are made, the stories that emerge are remarkably similar. Animals returning year after year, leaving gifts, showing behaviors that suggest memory and gratitude. It's as if the original story has become a template, a pattern that nature recognizes and responds to. There are skeptics, of course, people who insist it's all coincidence, anthropomorphism, wishful thinking. They point out that bears are intelligent animals who would naturally return to places where they had found shelter or food. They argue that the apparent gifts are just random objects that happen to accumulate in certain spots. They maintain that any sense of connection or communication is purely projection of human emotions onto animal behavior. And maybe they're right. Maybe there's a perfectly rational scientific explanation for everything that has happened at the cabin over the years. But for those who have experienced it, who have stood at the window and watched bears mourn a human passing, who have found carefully chosen stones left as gifts, who have seen wild animals teach their young to trust certain humans, rational explanations feel inadequate. They know, in a way that transcends scientific understanding, that something real and profound happened that night when a little girl gave her blanket to a bear in need. They know that kindness created a connection that has lasted for generations, that has changed both human and animal lives in measurable and immeasurable ways. The story continues to evolve, each generation adding their own chapter, their own experiences, their own interpretations. But the core remains the same, a reminder that we are not separate from nature but part of it. That kindness is never wasted, even when offered to those who cannot repay it in conventional ways. That the world is full of magic and mystery for those who approach it with open hearts and helping hands. That sometimes, on cold winter nights when the snow is falling and the wind is howling, miracles happen. Small miracles, perhaps, easily missed or dismissed, but miracles nonetheless. And so the cabin stands, a testament to the power of compassion, a bridge between worlds that should be separate but aren't, a place where the impossible happens regularly and nobody is surprised anymore. The bears continue to come, continue to remember, continue to teach their young about the humans who can be trusted. The humans continue to offer help, continue to receive gifts, continue to tell the story to anyone who will listen. And somewhere, in the space between human and wild, between civilization and nature, between possible and impossible, the spirit of that first act of kindness lives on, growing stronger with each passing year, each new connection, each blanket offered and accepted in the spirit of love.